It was the kind of deal that made you suspicious. A sprawling, two-story Victorian house nestled in the woods at the edge of town for a price that felt like highway robbery in reverse. "It's been on the market a while," the realtor explained, her smile tight and forced. "People get spooked by how isolated it is." That didn't bother me. After years in a noisy city, the idea of solitude felt like a blessing. The first week in the house was uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, cleaning, and exploring the property. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the creak of the old wooden floorboards. It felt peaceful, until it didn't. It started with the footsteps. I'd be in the kitchen or the living room and hear them upstairs. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I'd freeze, listening as they moved from room to room. But whenever I mustered the courage to go upstairs and check, the house was empty. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noise, I told myself, settling wood, the wind. But then, there was the door. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the front door slamming shut. Heart pounding, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and crept downstairs. The door was wide open, cold air streaming in, but the lock was intact, and there was no sign of forced entry. I'd locked it before bed. I was sure of it. The next morning, I installed new locks and a security camera. I convinced myself that someone had managed to pick the old lock. It was unsettling, but at least it was an explanation. That night, I checked the door 3 times before going to bed. It stayed shut. The following night, I reviewed the footage from the security camera. My stomach turned. Around 1:30 a.m., the door swung open on its own. No one touched it. No one was there. It just opened. I rewound the video and watched it again. Same thing. The door, opening slowly at first, then slamming against the wall. The timestamp confirmed I'd been asleep when it happened. By now, I was starting to question my decision to move here, but I couldn't afford to leave, not after sinking all my savings into the house. So, I stayed. And things got worse. It was the little things at first. Objects disappearing and reappearing in strange places, faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of a child laughing. It was faint but unmistakable, echoing through the empty halls. I don't have kids. I don't even have neighbors close enough for the sound to travel. I stayed in bed, paralyzed with fear, clutching my blanket like a shield. The laughter stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps. They were coming up the stairs. I bolted upright, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was determined to leave. I didn't care about the money anymore. I packed a bag, called a friend to let them know I was coming, and grabbed my car keys. But when I tried to leave, the car wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. Frustrated, I went back inside to call for a tow truck. The phone was dead. Not just no signal, completely dead, the screen black. It had been fully charged that morning. That's when I noticed the smell. A faint, acrid odor, like burning plastic. It seemed to be coming from the basement. I'd barely spent any time down there, but now I had no choice. If something was burning, I needed to stop it before the whole house went up in flames. Armed with a flashlight and a fire extinguisher, I descended the creaky stairs. The smell grew stronger with each step, making my eyes water. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and a thick layer of dust. But in the far corner, something caught my eye. A small wooden door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and the smell was strongest there. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get out of the house. But curiosity won. I pushed the door open. Inside was a small room, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were lined with strange symbols carved into the wood, and in the center of the room was a blackened, charred patch on the floor. A single candle, burned down to a nub, sat in the middle of it. The moment I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness, Panic set in as I fumbled with the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so close I could feel the vibrations in my chest. I screamed, pounding on the door, begging to be let out. The growl turned into a roar, and the room filled with a cold so intense it burned. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, the door flew open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I ran upstairs, grabbed my bag, and fled the house on foot. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where a passing car picked me up. I told the driver everything, but they just nodded, as if they'd heard it all before. I never went back to that house. I've since learned that no one stays there for long. The locals have their stories: a tragic fire, a family that vanished, a curse. I don't know what I believe. All I know is that something lives in that house, something that doesn't want to be disturbed. And it's still there, waiting for the next unlucky soul. Moving into a new house was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of grinding at a soul-crushing job, I'd finally saved enough to buy a place of my own. It wasn't anything fancy, a modest, 2-story house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The price was suspiciously low, but the realtor had assured me it was just a motivated seller situation. Motivated or not, the house was mine, and I was ready to leave my cramped apartment behind. The first night was uneventful. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the floors creaked more than I'd like, but nothing out of the ordinary. I unpacked a few boxes, set up my bed, and fell asleep easily, lulled by the quiet hum of suburban stillness. It was on the second night that things started to change. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I dried my hands and followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from upstairs. As I climbed the staircase, the tapping grew louder. By the time I reached the second floor, it had stopped altogether. I checked each room, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. Just empty rooms filled with shadows cast by the streetlights outside. I told myself I was being paranoid, a product of moving stress and too many late-night horror movies. Still, I locked my bedroom door before going to bed that night. The next morning I noticed something odd. A small damp patch had appeared on the ceiling of the living room. It was about the size of a dinner plate and had a faint reddish tint to it. I'd had enough experience with landlords ignoring maintenance issues to know a potential leak when I saw one. Determined to nip it in the bud, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way into the attic. The attic was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. My breath puffed out in small clouds as I scanned the space with my flashlight. That's when I saw it. In the far corner, beneath a broken window pane, was a makeshift bed, a dirty, tattered blanket, and a pillow that looked like it had been dragged through the mud. Surrounding it were empty cans of food, all meticulously arranged in a circle. And in the center of the circle was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine. It looked like a human figure, but the face was wrong. The features were distorted, almost melted, and the eyes were just hollow sockets. I backed out of the attic as quickly as I could, slamming the hatch shut behind me. My first thought was that some squatter had been living there before I moved in. But that didn't explain the figurine, or the chill, or the tapping. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I kept imagining that distorted figurine staring at me from the darkness. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the living room. Armed with a baseball bat, I crept downstairs. The tapping stopped the moment my feet touched the first floor. The damp patch on the ceiling had grown overnight, and now it was dripping, thick, red droplets that splattered onto the hardwood floor below. My stomach turned as the metallic scent of blood filled the air. I called the police. They arrived within 20 minutes and inspected the house thoroughly. No intruders, no signs of forced entry. They chalked it up to an animal getting into the attic and told me to get a roofer to fix the leak. The roofer came the next day and found nothing. No broken pipes, no dead animals. Nothing that could explain the damp patch or the dripping. He gave me a weird look when I insisted it had been blood. That night I decided to stay awake, determined to catch whatever was causing the noises. I set up a chair in the living room, baseball bat in hand, and waited. The hours dragged by, and just when I thought I might have been imagining it all, the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the walls. I froze, gripping the bat tightly as the sound moved, circling me. Tap, tap, tap. It was faster now, frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw something impossible. A hand, pale, gnarled, and covered in deep, jagged cuts, pushed through the wall, reaching toward me. I screamed and swung the bat, but the hand vanished, leaving behind only a faint, bloody smear. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I packed a bag and left, booking a room at the nearest motel. I called a priest to bless the house and even consulted a paranormal investigator who claimed the house had a dark energy. Apparently, the previous owner had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The realtor had conveniently left that detail out. I haven't been back since. The house is still mine, technically, but I can't bring myself to step foot inside. Sometimes late at night, I'll dream of the attic, of the figurine with its hollow eyes, and when I wake up, I can still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Moving into a new house was supposed to be a fresh start for me. After the divorce, I needed a place to clear my head, to figure out what my life looked like now. When I found the house, an old two-story Victorian on the outskirts of town, it felt perfect. Sure, it needed work, but I had time, and I thought I could use the distraction. The first night was uneventful. Just the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling, I told myself. I unpacked a few boxes, set up my bed, and fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. It started the next morning. I was making coffee when I heard it, a soft knock coming from the basement door. My first thought was that something had fallen. But when I opened the door and peered down into the dimly lit staircase, everything was still. Just a stack of old paint cans and a rusty toolbox left behind by the previous owner. I shrugged it off, but the knocks kept happening, always from the basement. Sometimes it was a single knock, sometimes a rapid series. It didn't make sense. I checked for drafts, loose pipes, anything that could explain the noise, but I found nothing. By the end of the week, the knocking had escalated. It would wake me in the middle of the night, echoing through the quiet house. Once I even heard it while I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the closed basement door. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. The basement was cold, colder than it should have been. My breath fogged in the beam of the flashlight as I scanned the space. The concrete floor was cracked in places, and cobwebs clung to the exposed beams, but nothing seemed out of place. That is, until I saw the writing. Scrawled in what looked like charcoal across one of the walls was a single word: leave. The letters were jagged, uneven, as if written in a hurry. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, shining the flashlight over the wall. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I'd like to say I packed my things and left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I convinced myself it was a prank. Maybe some neighborhood kid had snuck in before I moved in. I painted over the writing the next day and installed new locks on all the doors. For a few days, things were quiet. No knocks, no writing. I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing, but then I found the photographs. They were in a small envelope, tucked under a loose floorboard in the living room. Black and white pictures, faded with age. Each one showed the house, but it looked different, newer. And in every photo, there was a figure. A woman in a long dress, standing in the windows, on the porch, in the yard. Her face was blurred, like the camera had moved, but her eyes were always on the camera, on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the photos on the nightstand beside me. Around 3 a.m., the knocking started again. louder this time, more insistent. I stayed in bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child hiding from the monsters under his bed. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But it grew louder, closer. A woman's voice, soft and mournful, coming from the direction of the basement. She was saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't want to. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I told them someone was in my house, that I was hearing voices. They arrived within minutes, but they found nothing. No sign of a break-in, no one in the basement. Just me, shaking and pale, clutching those damn photos. The officers left, and I sat in the living room, the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not knocking this time. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. I forced myself to move, to follow the sound. The knife felt heavy in my hand as I climbed the stairs, my legs trembling. The footsteps led me to the guest bedroom. The door was ajar, and the air inside was freezing. She was standing by the window. The woman from the photographs. Her dress was tattered, her hair wild, and her eyes. God, her eyes. They were dark, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The next thing I knew, I was outside, barefoot in the snow, the front door swinging open behind me. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't even lock the door. I just got in my car and drove until the sun came up. The house is still there, as far as I know. Someone else might be living in it now, someone braver or more foolish than me. But I'll never forget her face, or the sound of her voice whispering that single chilling word. Stay.